Hello everybody and welcome back to the Jack Threlfall Show. We are back in the studio for episode 27 with lots to get into from all across the racing world. Let's get started. Okay, I think we should get started with the Formula One because it was the Azerbaijan Grand Prix last weekend. As we know, Baku always tends to deliver a pretty interesting race, but I think especially considering the championship we've had so far this year and where we are with the technical development of these cars, it was really important that Baku was there to deliver on the calendar because we had an exciting Spain or, exciting enough Spanish Grand Prix last season, and that's always considered to be one of the kind of letdowns of the calendar. And when we had, a decent amount of overtaking and action at Spain this year, I think, people were looking to the more exciting circuits, places like Baku. Going back there with these 2022 cars was going to be really, really critical. Also, to see what the drivers were like on the street tracks. We saw Monaco, which is a very slow speed, tight, twisty street track, and drivers that can specialise around those corners. Sergio Perez really improved on his performance there, and it's always interesting to see them get thrown those challenges. On the engineering level and also on the driving level, Baku presents a really, really interesting challenge because they have this kind of set-up compromise where you have to either be fast down the straights or fast through the slow speed corners. You can't ever really focus on both, and then once you add in the layer of porpoising and the problems that these cars have had when travelling at high speeds in a straight line through uneven surfaces, there are multiple things going on with these cars that are making them really, really uncomfortable in a straight line down the, especially the really long straight that we have at Baku. But it's tough always to reflect on what the FIA should do in that situation, and there's been a lot of conversations about that this weekend. But I think first and foremost regarding Baku, we should talk about the racing. And for the racing at the start, what we saw was a brilliant move by Sergio Perez into Turn 1 to take the lead from Charles Leclerc and show that the Red Bulls were ready to fight. The qualifying speed of the Ferraris has always been really impressive, and particularly the speed of Charles in those qualifying sessions. It seems like always at the end of Q3, once he can get a clean lap in, he's the fastest driver in qualifying this year. The uncomfortable statistic that arises there, though, is that Charles Leclerc could be better in qualifying, and his car as well could be better in qualifying than in the races, which is not ideal. As we always hear in Formula One, there's no points for Saturday. But after Turn 1, the Red Bull showed like the battle was on, and it looked like we really had a great race on our hands. But then the first kind of 10 to 15 laps of that race, we had Verstappen chasing down Sainz for P3, and there was a little bit of racing going on throughout the midfield. Obviously, we know Sebastian Vettel's incredible little, failed overtake initially, and then recovery from that re-entry to the track next to Tsunoda after his missed opportunity there on Esteban Ocon. His recovery was almost, forgiving the mistake that he made before, because it was so slick how he just drops it down into first, spins up the back tyres. As they say in drift competitions, he was hanging the spoiler over the barrier, right? When they send that back end round, the rear of the spoiler is the furthest kind of back bit of the car. So if you sling it round just enough, you can have the rear tyres touching the barrier and the spoiler hanging over the edge. That's always what they're going for in Drift Masters, European Drift Championships, that sort of thing. That's a motorsport that's judged most often on style points, and it's something that doesn't go down to the timesheets per se. And Sebastian Vettel, while he may have scored style points on social media, he did end up scoring actual points in the race too, which was really, really impressive. And I think it was his joint or maybe highest ever finishing position in the Aston Martin this year, which we know that Aston Martin's not really up to the standard it should be regarding the investment of the team, their new facilities they're building. We know they had a change of team principal last year, and that's always likely to unsettle a team and change its motivation slightly, but it can be hard to understand why Aston Martin are so far down on the grid. That Force India team and the Silverstone outfit, as it's been known since it's kind of changed name so many times, and it's one of those midfield teams where they've often outperformed their budget, and they've often been competitive midfield cars when the early Force India days and even into the Racing Point era. There were times where that team would show that it could develop a really quick car. But at the moment, the conversation really is about the split between Sebastian Vettel and Lance Stroll. Him and Latifi too, it seems like they're both really not connecting with the cars, whether it's the change in the driving style, whether it's the fact that the engineers kind of lean on more what their teammates say and they're not able to get the car targeted towards the setups they want. It's quite hard to tell, obviously, when you're looking in from outside what the cause of the slow speed is, but it could just be their driving. I mean, when you're getting beaten by that margin by your teammate, Latifi getting beaten often by Albon and Vettel outclassing Stroll, basically for 2 years now. It's you look at these drivers and it's really hard to justify their seats in the sport beyond the budget that they bring to the teams. But both Latifi and Stroll are heading into their home Grand Prix this weekend, so we'll see how that turns out. I know they're going to be, more on TV, more part of the promo, but it's unfortunate when you're going to the Canadian Grand Prix this year and, it's not two of the drivers that stand out as really top-class performers in 2022 that are going to be at their home Grand Prix and kind of in the face of the media, but we'll see how that turns out. It seemed like in the Azerbaijan Grand Prix that Max actually had the overall speed over Checo in terms of the Red Bull teammate battle. That's been a really interesting one to see this season so far. How Red Bull have, approached Sergio Perez being more competitive. Last year, he was so essential. We spoke to Jonathan about that, how essential Sergio Perez was in helping Max out, whether it's qualifying, whether it's compromising Sergio's strategy to help Max or, block off Lewis or Bottas. Everything that Perez needed to do last season, he really did do by the second half of it. There were questions at the start, obviously, with a new person coming into that Red Bull team, whether they'd be able to mix with the culture they've got there and the high expectations they have of the Red Bull drivers. And of course, questions were asked of Sergio Perez when he's taking the seat of someone like Alex Albon, who could have also been driving there last year and this year. And we all think it would be really, really interesting to see now Alex Albon, what he could do in that Red Bull. But ifs and buts are always going to be a part of the F1 driver market. And Sergio Perez is kind of answering the doubters, at least in Monaco. I feel like after Monaco, there was this great shift in the kind of narrative of the news, right? Because before, it was always focused on this part of Sergio Perez, second driver, what can he do to help Max win the championship? And then after Monaco, he demonstrated before in Spain, right, that he didn't like having his strategy compromised. And then Monaco, he goes out, wins a wet, dry Monaco, which is an absolutely fascinating race and a really stellar performance from him to keep it out of the barriers more than anything, and also manage those 3 different tyre compounds, his outlaps on the intermediates around Monaco. It's an incredible challenge, right? When you're on a Monaco track with mixed conditions, you put those intermediates on and you've got to switch them on, nail the temperature window, drive the right way where you're on the right parts of the track, but you're still going fast enough to keep the temperature and the brakes and the tyres. Everything that goes into keeping that car on the track and being the fastest out of anyone that day really shifted the narrative with Perez to being like, well, what if he's more like Webber in 2010, a real championship contender who puts the challenge on his teammate? The question gets asked now, of course, once we've seen with the way Ferrari won the championships with Schumacher and Lewis's championships with Valtteri Bottas as his teammate. It's definitely easier to run a team where you have a first and a second driver, and the decisions of strategy and race when you have drivers that are working together and not slowing each other down, not trying to take wins off each other and not compromising each other's strategy. The problem with that is it doesn't really end up as being more interesting for the fans. It's nice to see a team perform well together and kind of celebrate together after the races. But at the same time, you want the best driver to win and you would like a fair fight to occur. And it seems like, there's a cycle to it, right, where the teams will always say, well, the reason we prefer one driver over another is because that driver's faster. If the other driver was faster, we'd prefer him, right? But of course, with that explanation, what you can question then is, well, which order is that decision-making process happening in? Is he faster because you're preferring him, or are you preferring him because he is faster? And it seems like much at Red Bull was concerned with, the second of those two, right? Verstappen had always beaten his teammates in the same car since the end of the Ricciardo era. He'd beaten Gasly, he'd beaten Perez in 2021, and he'd beaten Alex Albon too more often than not. While we did see improvement from Albon, and he's turning into a brilliant driver with Williams this year, as we spoke about earlier, how he's outclassing Latifi. It did always seem like Red Bull were rational in their preference of one driver over another for the good of the team. When you've got a driver like Verstappen, I don't know, it could be hard not to think he's always going to be faster in all times and all conditions. But we've seen from Sergio Perez so far, before Baku at least, that he was willing to put up a bit of a challenge and kind of throw his name into the conversation of championship contenders. Unfortunately, at Baku, we saw a 1-2 for Red Bull where Max was leading, or at least, unfortunately for Perez. I'm sure very fortunately for Max, he would like to end that conversation very quickly and think, well, as much as you guys want to talk about Perez being a championship contender, I'm the reigning world champion, and I'm the one leading the world championship at the moment after that 1-2 at Baku. So really interesting to kind of see how that dynamic will play out. But it does seem like after Baku, Max has really reinstated the fact that, look, given equal conditions, I mean, A big factor, of course, in Sergio Perez's win at Monaco was the fact that Verstappen wasn't able to get a Q3 lap in, which may have potentially put him ahead of Perez, therefore ahead on strategy and therefore in a better position with the weather change. Max wasn't able to get that lap in because of Perez's crash at the end of Q3, right? So there's no insinuation that he did that on purpose, Sergio Perez, to block Max off or anything like that. I think the crash damage was too severe, and the nature of the crash was one of the more realistic crashes, right? And the reason I bring that up is because we saw Fernando Alonso in qualifying at Baku this weekend do something that was a little bit more 2015 Nico Rosberg style, where you intentionally cause a small yellow flag through what is quite obvious poor driving that is very uncharacteristic of a world champion like Fernando Alonso, loses control of the car in a very weird spot. Boom, yellow flag for the people behind him, and no more qualifying improvements to help his position stay at the nearest to the eliminated people in Q1, right? Or at least trying to stay above that line. Interesting tactics from Fernando, and they did work. You know, we've spoken about before, they have this rule in IndyCar where if you cause a yellow, you cause a red, and you cause a crash that messes up other people's qualifying laps, you're the one that gets punished, right? Not the people that were innocently going around trying to do their laps. It seems like a very obvious rule that Alex Albon was campaigning for afterwards in the press conferences, saying like, look, we know why other categories do this. It's to punish mistakes. This is Formula One. We're here to punish mistakes and reward the best drivers. And you have this weird little kind of disincentive of performance there, where it rewards drivers who can fake a mistake well. And there is that gamesmanship, there's that chess element in so much of Formula One, of use of the media, strategy calls, code names on the radio, all that sort of stuff, right? But I think in the eyes of all of the fans, really, intentionally messing up people's qualifying laps through fake mistakes and that sort of thing is over the line of what is entertaining and fair to the other competitors. And if someone did that to Alonso, he would be the first one to complain about it. But we know it's in Fernando Alonso's character very much to take the issue to the FIA. And look, while he may be happy eventually for the good of the sport if they do change the rules, he's happy in the moment while it's still allowed to be the one exploiting it. And look, the pressure goes at the FIA, I suppose, not him. If he's exploiting something that's legal, then it's the FIA's fault that it's illegal, not his fault for doing it, right? And I think that defense was used very much by Mercedes and Red Bull regarding the team radio stuff last year and the sort of coercion and slippery sliminess that they were all going through. In terms of other headlines from Baku, there was George Russell getting on the podium with the Mercedes. That was a pretty impressive drive from him. And also Lewis Hamilton recovering from far back on the grid at one point to find his way back through everyone and keep his head throughout some really intense scenarios. But really a good performance for the Mercedes team in the context of a double DNF for Ferrari, right? Double technical DNF for Ferrari is so brutal. So brutal. And you just feel so bad for Carlos and Charles. Ultimately, they're trying to save this team. They're trying to deny all the haters that are saying, look, Ferrari, they're a bottle job. You know, they can never bring home a championship. They failed in 2017. They failed in 2018. They failed in 2005, 2006, right? They were uncompetitive largely because of their tyres, right? But they were unseated by Renault. And then 2007, they only won it with Kimi by a very, very slim margin. 2008, they won it for about 30 seconds and then were unseated by Lewis. 2009, they had a bad car. 10 to 12, they were very competitive with Alonso, but ultimately lost to Red Bull because of some crashes, some unluckiness, and bad strategy calls, and the randomness of Formula One that played out in those years. It was going to be very hard to win the title through those eras, but Red Bull won 4 in a row, constructors and drivers, so you've got to really show that they were the better team throughout those years, and Ferrari failed to win there. Then once they got their chance with Vettel and Raikkonen in the hybrid era, we saw similar issues play up, right? And it is wrong. I think it's a failure of analysis to be like, well, it's the same Ferrari making the same mistakes they always have done. Because it's not. It's not like the staff have changed that little throughout the years that people are just going to be making the same mistakes and not learning. It's kind of silly to propose that a Formula One team would fail on that scale for that long. These are incredibly complex, high-performing organisations, and Ferrari's not unlike the other teams in that they are really disciplined and focused on performance, and the romanticism of Ferrari to kind of retain that passion of Italy, that red car. You know, one of my favourite quotes of all time is the quote from Enzo Ferrari where he says, "You ask a child to draw a car and they colour it in red." I'm sure he probably said it in Italian in a much more beautiful way than that. But Ferrari is the most famous brand in the world, and they're an icon of Formula One, and to suggest that their failures are just characteristic of an overall lack of good quality people in the team, stuff like that, it's wrong, because ultimately they keep producing near enough to championship winning cars. The technical marvel of the 2022 Ferrari car is absolutely incredible. The speed that it has in qualifying, the connection they've got it to with Charles Leclerc and how well he's able to drive it, that's a credit to the team, right? The fact that they're in the position to be in the championship fight in the first place, they should be, because of their budget and the investment and how important Ferrari is to the sport. Their recruitment for the drivers, Ferrari are always going to be a team that has two of the best drivers on the grid, and their recruitment for staff and engineers as well. They're always going to be a team that attracts the best talent in the world to Maranello, and to draw that kind of passion, that incredible performance that Ferrari have. But then it's so frustrating when you see things like double technical DNFs, and it looked like on some level there was a connection to the power unit, because we saw some failures in the customer teams too. But it's just so tough to watch with Ferrari. They get so close but so far so often. And the double technical DNF, it's just more pressure. Charles Leclerc, Canada now, he's going to be looking to just score some points, finish the race and be on the podium. It feels so long that we've had a good weekend from Ferrari without any mistakes, whether it is Carlos Sainz crashing, whether it's technical failures, whether it's strategy mistakes. Really, really tough to watch at the moment, Ferrari, but I'm a fan of the sport in general, and the sport's always better when we've got a fast Ferrari, so I'm really willing on the recovery of that team, and just please let Charles Leclerc finish a race. I think that's about as much as I can say. So we're definitely hoping for a recovery, or at least some signs of change at Ferrari at Canada this weekend. We've also got a new technical directive coming in regarding the porpoising and the bouncing issues that I think only happened maybe yesterday or the day before. I'm recording this on Friday at the moment, so we've got free practice to come up later today. Everyone will be looking at FP2 for the quali times to see what happens there. But the new technical directive for porpoising is effectively just putting a sensor in the car that limits the effect to protect the safety of the drivers, right? So if you cross over this boundary of what the FIA deem to be like an acceptable level of porpoising, where, it's a function of the car, but it's not going to be something injuring the drivers or keeping them out of races or something that they're going to be complaining about at the end of races. So it's definitely important that we've got the FIA to step in there and put a limit, because it did seem like something that Mercedes were particularly putting pressure on the FIA to get involved in. But at the same time, it doesn't seem yet like Mercedes are going to be able to take advantage of this change or anything. I don't think it was particularly the rule change that Mercedes were looking for, because I think they would have preferred maybe just a minimum ride height or something to level the playing field a bit more. But the sensor, and then, having the penalty be triggered or the technical kind of change in the car be forced if your car is going over this limit of what they deem acceptable, doesn't really change too much for Mercedes if they can't solve the problem on their own anyway. So I think it's probably the right turn from the FIA. I think I saw basically that suggestion offered by Craig Scarborough, who works for F1 TV and I think used to work for BBC Sport too as like a technical correspondent. And I always think really the technical analysis is where the best observations and kind of most interesting discussion is week to week. Obviously there's the off-track stuff and the drama in the driver market. But when I look to the journalists that I find come up with, new and interesting and actually information that is going to be applied to the races that we haven't heard from the teams, and they're pointing out things that maybe the teams have developed in secret or they're trying to hide from the media, and we can really work out what's making these cars go faster and where the advantages are. Of course, it's good to talk about the business side too, the driver market and all the elements that go into running Formula One. But on the technical side, I feel like that's an opportunity for really great analysis. And I think especially with the porpoising issue and so much technical debate this year focused on problems like that, we've seen, a solution to that problem, which is really important. Canada always tends to deliver races that are affected by weather. We can remember, I think 2011 was this kind of epic, wet, dry, last to first performance from Jenson Button with like 2 red flags. And it's actually the reason they now have a 2-hour time limit on races that have to happen in this 2 hours worth of racing in a 4-hour window is how they police it. Because they were overrunning in Canada in 2011 because they had to do so many weather changes and adjustments for this kind of crazy rainfall that was coming in. They just kept waiting and waiting, and they were still trying to host the race. I think the problem at the end of the day there was that while the race did end up being amazing, and that kind of chaos, that craziness plays into the hand of some drivers more than others, and we saw Jenson Button put in a really excellent performance that day, overall it was a bit of a failure from the race direction, from the sponsors, to put kind of a cohesive event together where everything's going to plan, and that's why we now have the time limit. But even beyond 2011, basically every single year after that, Canada has delivered some kind of change up to the driver market, whether it's a big crash, a controversial accident, high-speed incident. We've got 3 DRS zones at Canada, we've got a tight hairpin. There's plenty of opportunities, I think, even with these new cars. The fact that we've got 3 DRS zones and not just the one on the back straight like it's been before, or the pit straight and the back straight, but you also have this kind of third one in the middle sector. It should really draw the cars close together throughout the lap, and we know now that these cars are happy to sit more in the 0.8, 0.7 second range without compromising their tyres too much, whereas in the years before it may have been more like 1.2 or 1.3 seconds where the cars were kind of taking punishment there and they were sticking without the DRS. It didn't really encourage good racing, and we have seen before a little bit kind of processional moments at Canada, but a little bit like the start at Baku. There's a tendency in the first stint of these races where drivers can be protecting their tyres a lot and not wanting to be the one that makes the risky move and ends their race on lap 5, lap 10 or whatever before the first round of pit stops. So there can always be this phase at the start where it might seem like the racing's getting a little bit boring, getting a little bit dry, and no one's taking any risks. But like Baku, I'm expecting if that does happen at the start, it'll all change up pretty quickly. And we know, I think at the moment, it's wet conditions there, so we could have a wet start. Hopefully we have the grid lights working, unlike in Monaco, which was an interesting element that was playing out there. In terms of technical notes for Canada, Baku, we spoke about how it's a technical compromise between high speed and slow speed corners, high speed straights, and slow speed corners, and how they balance the aerodynamics and the drag there. Canada, technically, the biggest challenge is the braking zones, because you have a lot of chicanes and then that big heavy braking zone at the corner. And then the final chicane, it's braking down from very high speeds. So it's often been said that Canada is the biggest test on the brakes of any single circuit. So saying that, it means we could have some brake failures. We saw Lando Norris's brakes overheat, I think, in his debut year there in 2019. But I think there's plenty of opportunity for moments like that where we could see brake failures, we could see drivers having to compromise other elements of the car to protect the brakes. They could be wary of the tyres overheating and the brakes kind of influencing the tyres overheating and preventing them from getting close to other cars. It could play out in that way, but when you get challenges like that, what that does ultimately is reward the teams with the best cars, and it may be a challenge we haven't seen too much of yet. I know Jeddah is probably quite heavy on the brakes, but they're kind of more medium speed corners there, whereas Canada, most of the braking zones, you're braking down to slow speed from high speed, so it's kind of a full pressure effect, which plays out in wearing the brakes down a lot. So maybe we'll see some technical failures, hopefully not for Ferrari, because we've spoken earlier about how that's really starting to let down their season, and if that keeps happening, then they could really be in big trouble. We've also, it's the home race for Latifi and Stroll, both of them needing turnarounds in their season. So we shall see. Hopefully Mercedes can come up with some sort of technical solution that gets around the technical directive and, just overall reduces the amount of porpoising on their car so both drivers can go faster. It did seem like Lewis was suffering a bit more than George, maybe just because of their different physicalities. Obviously, Lewis kind of over 10 years older than George. But it would be great, to have both Mercedes cars in the fight, and then we need it for the championship. If we're going to have Ferrari not being able to deliver a consistent week-to-week performance and have multiple technical failures, pit stops, strategy errors, that sort of thing, Red Bull have had so many years to optimise their team and optimise their performance, and have made a lot of mistakes throughout the years too, but they're in such a great place now with all their systems optimised in that team. It's hard to see how a team that's performing like Ferrari is at the moment is going to take a championship challenge to Red Bull if they can't improve on those issues. And we know a team like Mercedes really optimised those same systems in their years of championship dominance, but now they don't really have the car to compete. So if they can apply that, bring their technical development back to where it needs to be, and kind of get around this new porpoising issue, then we could be in for a really brilliant Grand Prix this weekend. I'm not sure if that kind of 3-car title battle is going to come until maybe the second half, or maybe even the final third of the season, where it may be too late for anyone to challenge Verstappen and Red Bull. But we'll see. I'm positive about Formula One at the moment. I think it's in a good spot. The year so far has been really, really interesting. There's been something to talk about every single weekend, including Spain, which is always fun. Baku delivered as a pretty exciting race. No full safety car in Baku. Everyone talks about there being a statistical certainty that a safety car would show up, but we didn't get that in Baku. Maybe we'll be overdue one and get a couple at Canada. But of course, anyone with a brain will know that's not really how statistics works, and you can't rely on them too much because at the end of the day, unpredictable things still happen quite often, and there's no point hedging your bets too much or trying to make too many bold predictions because we know from last year even how much is going on, and even how many people would have predicted Leclerc to have 2 more race victories than he currently has, right, with his technical failures, or even Bahrain in Leclerc's first year, retiring from the lead in that race. The guy's been suffering a long time with failures and with letdowns from the team, so it would be really important if they can bring that season around and deliver us a really exciting Canadian Grand Prix. But I think with that, we can move on to some other categories and dive into the rest of the world of motorsport. Last weekend at Baku, we also had Formula 2 in action. It was a really exciting race there where we had Juri Vips leading the feature race. We spoke about, with Josh, we spoke about Juri Vips' place in the Red Bull Driver Academy and him against Liam Lawson and Dennis Hauger and who's really competing to be next in that AlphaTauri seat. To be honest, with the performances that Yuki's been putting in this year, it's hard to see how a rookie could come in and replace him and do any better, really. We know he struggled sometimes with qualifying speed and his relationship with the team, and, you know, functioning as a rookie in Formula 1 is really, really tricky. But I think we've seen a pretty solid performance from Tsunoda, and he's near the back of the grid overall, but he's better than Stroll, he's better than Latifi, you know, people like that. He is in the conversation as being one of the better drivers in Formula 1, and with the AlphaTauri at the tracks this year, the AlphaTauri is going to perform well at. Hopefully we can see some more out of him. But in Formula 2 at the Baku Grand Prix in the feature race there, as I said, we had Juri Vips crashing out of the lead at the castle section. A very Charles Leclerc, I am stupid moment. Unfortunately for him, you know, leading the race, crashing through that tiny twisty castle section just over the width of a car there as you take that racing line, and Vips just couldn't get it right and effectively handed the win to Dennis Hauger, who took the win, Logan Sargent P2 and Felipe Drugovich P3, who Felipe Drugovich extends his championship lead even further. I'm massively biased now, but I'm a fan of Felipe Drugovich purely because my video about him with Josh is now the biggest video on the whole YouTube channel. It's got over 3,000 views in like a week and a half now. But for a video to get traction like that, to get growth like that, and that I can see from the geography of the video too, that a lot of the support for the video and kind of people interacting and commenting on it is coming from Brazil. So it's really cool actually to see that the motorsport community is got behind Drugovich in Brazil, and that they're representing him as to be, you know, a champion for Brazilian motorsport. We don't have a Brazilian driver in Formula 1 at the moment, and we know how integrated the history of Formula 1 is with the country of Brazil, and what an amazing country it is. When you go to the Brazilian Grand Prix, you see how they got behind Felipe Massa, not only the year when he so nearly won the championship, but also the 2 times where he kind of retired. I think it was at the end of 2014 where he did this kind of big amazing thing. He actually had to, it's funny, so he had to retire from the race, and because the Brazilian Grand Prix was the last Grand Prix of the season, it was actually his retirement from Formula 1 overall. And while the race was still going on, I believe it was 2014, everyone was kind of clapping, standing up, celebrating Felipe Massa like it was the end of the race. No one really was paying attention to what was going on track, because there was this beautiful kind of moment where Massa was walking down the pit lane. Everyone's like, oh my God, you know, what a career he's had, what an icon for Brazilian motorsport. And then it was announced like a few months later, I think, or at least in the off season, that Felipe Massa would return for another year. And then the year after that, he did the same thing over again, where the Brazilian Grand Prix was the last race of the season that year. And he got to go through and wave to all his fans again. So a weird moment for him, but great to see Felipe Drugovich getting accepted into Brazilian motorsport. It was also a good performance from Enzo Fittipaldi in the F2 race there. Good from him to be up in the points in a car that overall is not going to be competing for wins this season, but we know he's got a lot of backing. We know he's got a lot of fans in Formula 1. He's the Haas reserve driver, I believe, at the moment. And important for him to be getting in good race performances too, right? So that was pretty cool. Felipe Drugovich is now 49 points clear at the top of the Formula 2 championship. It's quite rare that you can say that in Formula 2, where you would have a driver be so clear at the front of the championship because of the way they run their sprint races that reverse the qualifying order. And you kind of get this situation where if you're qualifying well, you'll be near the front in the feature races, but it's going to force you to be in the midfield and near the back of the pack in the sprint races. And that often means you're going to get tangled in incidents, right? And the good thing about that is that it leads to close championships, because it's very hard to lead a championship it can be really, really hard to lead the championship in Formula 2 because depending on your qualifying speed, you're either going to be running in the midfield in the sprint race or running in the midfield in the feature race. And what often happens in Formula 2 then is you're going to get caught in incidents more often. And the good thing about that is, as I said, it brings the championship closer together, right? And you rarely get people leading the championships by such a margin, especially if nothing else, because their teammate is likely to be close to them, right? If you've got a situation where you have a driver who's really gapping the rest of the field, at a minimum, you expect their teammate to be up there with them. And we don't really see that from Felipe Drugovich. So you can understand why he's got this following and got this fan base in Brazil. Really, really cool to see him come up there. And for two other championship contenders this year that a lot of people have got their eyes on, Liam Lawson and Jack Doohan, it was 0 points for either of them in the feature race, which is not good for their championship challenge. Liam Lawson falling back, but at the same time, Yuri Vips crushing out of the lead of that race. You know, it can be hard for either of them to then compete with Dennis Hauger, who is now leading the Baku race, taking home the victory there of the feature race, his first feature race win in Formula 2, which is really big for him. He's also in that driver academy for Red Bull, and he's in one of the Prema cars in Formula 2 this year, which is going to be, better than Enzo Fittipaldi's car and going to be running near the front more often. If we see Dennis Hauger get into a rhythm, get into a swing, like we've seen Felipe Drugovich get into, then that massive lead Drugovich has could come quickly tumbling down, especially if Drugovich gets an unlucky DNF like we've seen. He's been kind of gliding on that margin where he's finishing races more often than you're statistically meant to in Formula E. So it could be time we get a bit of regression to the mean and we see some more incidents coming up later on. You don't want to play too much into the gambler's fallacy there, where you're predicting the odds of future events on the outcome of previous ones, because at the end of the day, it's going to depend on what Drugovich does in the car as to whether he's going to get caught in more incidents or not. But I'm just thinking in terms of what will tend to happen, even if he does get a big championship lead. It could be, though, if, taking that championship lead gets in his head and it's really hard to lead a championship for that long, to have that margin to the rest of the field, everyone else can only gain. And at a weekend where you're not winning, you're going to be losing some sort of margin at the front of your championship. So we know from the battle between Lewis and Max in Formula 1 last year, the relationship between the hunter and the hunted is an interesting one, and it plays out in the strategy, because if you're leading the championship, you can afford to be a little bit more conservative with your strategy in a way, and you can kind of take a P4 or a P5 here and there instead of maybe boxing early in wet conditions and risking a intermediate outlap where you could gain positions or you could fall back. You can afford, when you're at the front of the championship, you've made up your points in other races, so you can bring home the points that you need to. And we spoke about with Tom, it's about where you finish when you're not winning that's going to win you a championship. You need to win a certain amount of races, and you're not going to be in the chance with a fight if you're never winning. But when you're not winning, as long as you're still winning at a high enough base rate, it's important to kind of still beat your rivals in that context. It's possible that neither of you are going to have good races, and in the situation where you're both not performing well, you still got to be better than the rest of the field. Reminds me actually of a quote from Tiger Woods where he speaks about the kind of reasons why he was able to dominate the game of golf for so long. He basically explained the competitiveness on tour in this way, right? So he said, "We know everyone here is good, right? It's not about how good your good is, it's about how good your bad is. And if your bad is as good as Tiger Woods, then it's better than a lot of people's goods. And it's going to bring home some pretty clinical performances on the golf course, and you can extend that to the racetrack." So I suppose the extrapolation of that and what it really means is that on a bad day, you have to be resilient to that, and you have to be performing under difficult conditions and training yourself to perform under those difficult conditions, knowing what your bad shots are. In racing, maybe it's what your bad braking habits are, or how you tend to overheat your tires, or how you get caught in incidents. Knowing what the flaws to your game are, working on them, making them less significant, and still retaining all your strength is what's going to build a championship contender. I'm willing on Felipe Drugovich mostly because the better he does, the more he leads the championship, the more search interest and Twitter followers he gets, stuff like that. The more people are Googling him, and the more times my video about him comes up. So I'm happy. Felipe Drugovich, let's go, mate. Let's bring the championship home. But what happens if he does win, right? If we see another Formula 2 championship, but you've got to ask the question there, what if he does win, and then we see another year, last year Oscar Piastri wins Formula 2, doesn't get promoted to a Formula 1 seat immediately. Then we might see Felipe Drugovich win Formula 2 this year, also not get promoted to a Formula 1 seat. What's going on there? What's the point of Formula 2? It's designed, it's named even in the marketing, the road to Formula 1. There's a roadblock at the moment because Formula 1 is full of good drivers, and there's not a lot of room if you're not a paid driver with a bigger budget and better talent than the current paid drivers that we've got. Those are really the only ones we can see moving around. In terms of Piastri, I know the upcoming news for him is that he's going to be replacing Nicholas Latifi in the Williams seat for at least 2 years on loan from Alpine. That's basically been confirmed. I don't think it's been officially announced by Formula 1, but for all intents and purposes, that's a done deal, which is cool to see for him, right? Impressive that he's able to get that drive in Formula 1 eventually, and maybe we will see the same for Felipe Drugovich. Who knows? But leading the Formula 2 championship at the moment, and an important weekend for him too, right? He wasn't winning the race, but he was finishing P3 when he wasn't winning, and his bad was still quite good. So yeah, Felipe Drugovich, more power to you, mate, and shout out to the nation of Brazil. Stepping away from FIA Motorsport, we also had the IndyCar Grand Prix at Road America last weekend, which is a really, really brilliant track, Road America. It's a diverse track with high speed, slow speed, and medium speed corners that is a real test of the drivers. And in a way, it's a little bit like the American Nürburgring. It's got a few corners there that are really challenging, and it sets you up in this environment where you've got a very thin, windy track surrounded by grass, but also the walls are quite tight, and you do see a lot of yellows. And the Nürburgring's really interesting in that sense because it's not a street track as such, but the runoff area isn't too big, and it's so undulating and so close to the walls at times that it can feel really constraining and a bit more like a street track. And I think Indy Road America was kind of similar in that way. We saw it was really dirty offline, so overtaking, making moves with the push-to-pass system that they have in IndyCar. Obviously, there's no DRS, so the overtaking is a bit more fluid, a bit more kind of available at every point in the track. But the IndyCar Grand Prix at Road America treated us to an absolutely exceptional race that was won by Joseph Newgarden, and he was bringing the championship challenge back to Will Power and looking to bring some points home for the Penske team. We saw a collision between last year's championship winner Alex Palou and this year's Indy 500 winner Marcus Ericsson that Palou was not very happy about at all, and he was complaining immediately in his post-race interview about the fact that he was hit by his teammate. So some rumblings of problems at Chip Ganassi, and we shall see how those play out. But hopefully it's an interesting one, and hopefully it plays out on track, right, and not just in a meeting. But we know how good Palou is, and we know a big part of his championship last year was keeping his head in those scenarios. But he's got a significant margin to the championship leader at the moment. You know, a tricky 500, a place where O'Ward and Ericsson extended their kind of championship challenge, brought home a bunch of points, and doing really, really well. And, you know, it was an interesting race throughout the pack. Romain Grosjean did really well in this race. We saw him go finishing P4. The push-to-pass system at the end played a really interesting role because there was this late restart, right? And because I spoke about earlier, the nature of the track, the design of the track, while it is like a traditional race circuit, it's also one that's going to generate a lot of yellow flags because of how hard it is to wheel cars away sometimes, and just because of how close the racing is, really. You're going to get a lot of incidents where cars run into each other, or they spin off, or they have these technical failures, and it's not going to be super easy to recover them, so you need that yellow flag to come in and bunch the cars back up. They don't have as much of a system of like localized yellow flags in IndyCar. If there's a significant spin and there's someone off, you're not going to see a situation like a virtual safety car or anything like that we see in Formula 1. In IndyCar, a bit more like NASCAR in that sense. It's kind of, well, if there's a bit of a problem, we'll go straight to caution. And in terms of race direction too, I also wanted to touch on the Indy 500, right? There was a late red flag restart there, and it could have been a situation where, a little bit like the end of the Formula 1 World Championship in 2020, an incident towards the end of the race threw up a big, set of question marks where everyone was going to be like, well, what do we do here? Is it a safety car? You've got all this chaos going into the end of the Indy 500. And the race directors there made the call that a lot of people have kind of concluded that Michael Massey should have made, right? And instead of throwing the yellow flag and then having to rush the safety car procedure or the caution procedure and kind of over-rush the repair of the barrier and, getting the car out the way, the repair of the track, all of that, what they did at the end of the Indy 500 was a red flag restart. And it's notable in saying that they don't have standing starts at the Indy 500 or in IndyCar at all, right? So when you call a red flag and then you do a red flag restart, it's actually a rolling restart like a safety restart in Formula 1. So it does kind of protect the leaders a little bit more because they get to lead with speed and obviously get on the power earlier. So overall, it turned out fair. There were no complaints about that race direction at all. There was no rushing of the procedure under the yellow flag. There was no pressure on the marshals. There was no condemnation of the driver that caused it for messing up another driver's chance at the 500, because they all got equal chances at the red flag restart. Everything that went into that was kind of positive, and I thought maybe a learning opportunity for Formula One there. But overall, in terms of last weekend's IndyCar action, I think the positive thing that we can take out of it is that we really do have 4 teams now that are able to build race-winning cars every weekend, and those are Penske, Andretti, Ganassi, and the McLaren entry, which is obviously now being brought into the conversation in Formula One because of the questions about Daniel Ricciardo saying, look, he's contracted to the team until the end of next year, but potentially that contract to the team doesn't maybe mean the McLaren Formula One team. I know that may be a bit of speculation on my end, but when we hear Daniel Ricciardo say, I'm contracted to McLaren, well, so's Pato O'Ward. What if they want to give a clean swap, Pato for Ricciardo, see how they both do, and then maybe potentially switch them back Red Bull style if the performance doesn't work out? But I feel like maybe Ricciardo would benefit from some easy wins if he can go to IndyCar, be in a race-winning car, and take a really good challenge there to the rest of the IndyCar grid, get some wins under his belt, remind everyone how good he is, and then come back into Formula One off that kind of swell of popularity. But it may be really, really hard for Ricciardo to get back in if he leaves, if he goes to IndyCar. It could be the end, right? No one's talking about Romain Grosjean returning, and maybe Daniel Ricciardo. Unfortunately, we know he's a much better driver than Grosjean is, and probably a lot of the IndyCar grid. But the reality is with Formula One, even with the new Andretti entrants, it's full. It's full of brilliant drivers and some pay drivers that are really clogging up the market. And if you're someone like Daniel Ricciardo who is losing to his teammate, he left Red Bull so he could go and beat his teammate, right? That's what he did with Hulkenberg, and it's what he did with Ocon, was to show that he was, car for car, or pound for pound, should we say, better than enough of the drivers to earn a seat, to earn high pay, to earn priority over other drivers and be desired in that driver market. That's what got him recruited at McLaren, the proof that he was able to go and show that he could do that. But we've arrived back at a tricky situation for him where he's not the one getting priority, and he's having to really fight his turn on the radio to even get some kind of consideration for a team that all seems fully intent on pushing Lando Norris above all else. But we'll see how that plays out, and maybe it could be an opportunity for Ricciardo to go to IndyCar. I know I'd be pretty happy. I know Tom Gaymore, our favourite Sky Sports host, would be pretty happy too. Would bring a lot of attention now to, we see IndyCar growing in the UK. Another F1 driver going there would be huge for the series, and potentially not exactly what Ricciardo wants, but maybe overall what might be best for the driver market, shake it up a bit and see how things fall. But overall for Indy Road America, positive notes, and looking to the rest of the season there. Hopefully that 4-way championship battle plays out. Beyond the world of open wheel racing, we also had the Le Mans 24-hour race last weekend, and it was a fascinating one there. To be honest, it was one of the first Le Mans events that I've really kind of tried to pay attention to and check in with throughout the 24-hour window. It's such a different event to watch, obviously compared to all other non-endurance categories of motorsport, because of the nature of the way Le Mans is set out, the format of it, the amount of different cars and drivers you have on track at the same time. You effectively get constant overtaking, and you get thrown all these different situations where you might have yellow flags, you might have pit stops at weird times. The strategy battle is really, really hard to comprehend, and I think one of the standouts for me as a kind of first-time viewer, right, and someone that was really relying on the punditry and the broadcast and the analysis of the commentators to understand what was going on, to understand what the context of the teams was, why Toyota are simply so amazing in that hypercar category, and why it's going to be so hard to unseat them from their dominant victory that they took last year and the one that they've taken this year. It was the number 8 car with Sebastian Buemi, Brendan Hartley, and Ryo Hirakawa, who was actually making his debut at Le Mans this year, that won for Toyota in the hypercar category. So that was amazing for them. It was the number 39 car that won in the LMP2 category from their teammate Yota car. I think that's how you pronounce it. That's how the teammates were pronouncing it. So we'll go with that. And in the GT Pro category, it was the number 63 and the number 64 Corvettes that were looking like the dominant challengers throughout the race. but both of those cars suffered DNFs, and it was actually the number 91 Porsche that brought home the win there, and it was in the GT amateur class, it was the number 33 Aston Martin. As a first-time viewer, it's hard for me to pretend like I've got any kind of new information to add beyond just what my first impressions were. And in my first impressions, one of the things that stood out was how good the track management was, right? Especially when you're racing throughout the night. It's such a challenge for the race direction when you've got so many cars on track and so much chaos going on. We saw one thing that was exclusive, I think, to maybe Le Mans overall, but potentially the rest of the World Endurance Championship as well. God, I'm really stuttering here. But what I'm talking about is the slow zones, so a system a little bit like a double-waved yellow flag or a virtual safety car, but if that virtual safety car was only applied to a specific sector of the track, because Le Mans, it's not as long as the Nordschleife, right, but it's longer than Spa, it's bigger than a traditional Grand Prix circuit. When you have incidents that are kind of in between a local yellow flag where you just kind of have to lift off or be prepared to stop right through that corner, you get these zones that they called slow zones, which were, enforced mandatory speed limits. So like a virtual safety car, you have an imposed limit of everyone going the exact same speed through this zone, but basically avoiding the safety car, right? So that was an interesting note on race direction. The big incident that I think was on everyone's minds and the kind of biggest crash of the event was between one of the Corvette cars in the GT Pro category and one of the LMP2 cars, where it was kind of an overtake, one of those situations where you do have a LMP2 car going past the GT car. You get this constant flow of overtakes at Le Mans because there are no blue flags, but you have 4 different categories of drivers in 3 different categories of cars, as I've said before in the podcasts. You get the situation where you do have to overtake people that are going in much slower cars than you. It can be hard to anticipate where those gaps are going to be, right? Because you're trying to maintain the run that you've got in the LMP2 car. You don't want to get held up. You don't want to get held up, by these slower GT cars in front of you. But at the same time, you have to know that they're not obliged to let you past in the fastest way possible. They've got their own race going on. And picking your way through that is what creates these scenarios where it's really, really hard to pick the perfect line. And when you're trying to balance, racing the cars around you with other cars that are in their own races and neither want to compromise, I think really that's what we saw in the collision there. It was cool to see Brendan Hartley again. We know his time in Formula One wasn't the best, and he actually, at Baku, in his time in Formula One, he had this kind of big significant thing with Pierre Gasly where he nearly hit him in a braking zone in practice, and it was a really scary moment there that goes down in Formula One history as, well, one of the best reaction saves, the best near crashes saved by Pierre Gasly from being a crash. That's kind of one of the only things that lasts in Brendan Hartley's memory, in Formula One at least. But in endurance categories, he's a real star, and the reason he was brought into Formula One in the first place was because of his win of the 2017, I think, the 2017 World Endurance Championship. He wins that as a Red Bull driver with Red Bull logos on his car, and then they're like, right, we got to get this kid in Formula One. But I think it was pretty telling when we spoke to Josh about how Formula One is in New Zealand and the history of Formula One in New Zealand. He didn't have a lot to say about Brendan Hartley because I think ultimately his performances were not up to the scratch they needed to be to make a dent in Formula One. It was cool to see Prema competing. So Prema, we spoke about earlier, the Formula 2 team that's entering with Dennis Hauger and some other drivers in Formula 2 this year. They were also kind of sponsoring at least a team in Le Mans this year, and it was cool to see them integrate their kind of cross-category motorsport team, a bit like what we're seeing McLaren do. So that was a nice thing. What's also worth mentioning about Le Mans this year particularly is the fact that, next year at Le Mans is going to be really, really different. So the hypercar category that's been traditionally dominated by Toyota, or at least the LMP1 category that it was called before, while Toyota were really dominating it, that's now has been replaced by this hypercar category. This was the first year of the hypercars, but next year we're going to see the kind of inclusiveness. It's going to be almost the real first year where the fact that you've now changed those rules, it's more appealing to other factories to come in. We saw the Glickenhaus team run this year. They came 3rd and 4th in the category, and then the Alpine team running behind that. But unfortunately, we saw these big gaps, right, where no one ever looked like they could challenge Toyota, and the other 2 LMP H teams, the hypercar teams, were just there to show, it was possible to compete there, but there was no real challenge lobbied against Toyota. And hopefully we're going to see that change next year. We see the manifestation of why these rules were changed to allow these teams to come in, there's going to be a time lag between changing the rules and then when the teams can actually finish building their cars, finish all their business side, and, bring the car actually to the race. That's expected to happen next year, not only in the hypercar category, but also in the GT cars. Everyone's looking for more manufacturers, more different cars. We saw Ferrari, Porsche, Aston Martin, and Corvette this year. Really cool to see them at the track. But touring car racing, GT3 spec, they're calling it for next year, opening up the rules a little bit, making it easier for manufacturers, making it ridiculously, cheaper for them compared to what it is now to enter the races. It's going to allow more manufacturers in, and it's going to show Le Mans to be really the maximum race it can be next year. You've got all these different cars that are going to perform differently throughout the track. Then you add in the layer that you've got different categories of cars that, of course, are also performing differently. That generates racing. That generates a brilliant race. And the unification of the Triple Crown. We spoke with Tom about how the Triple Crown is in 2022 and the role it plays in modern motorsport. But Le Mans as an event in that Triple Crown, I think there's no denying that it's an absolutely amazing event, and winning it is so much more of a team effort. Purely the fact that, there are other drivers in your car. You are, for over 50% of the race, not in the car, of course. And then the meaning of that, you're not going to be able to contribute what you feel like maybe your maximum contribution is, because you're relying on these other members of the team to help you bring the win home. So satisfying when you see that pulled off, and the celebrations at the end of Le Mans were really, really awesome. We've also got, as I always love to mention, the friends of the show, what they're up to. Jamie Price, photographer, star photographer of the Formula One world and overall motorsport photography world. He was at Le Mans this year, and he'll be at the Canadian Grand Prix this weekend too. So, as I always say, check out his Instagram for some really brilliant angles, some brilliant moments to get captured throughout the weekend, and just such an impressive talent that he's got behind that camera, and openness. The fact that he's so open on social media about what his world is like, and just a normal kind of open, nice guy when he has, I'm sure, the exact right to not do any of that. If he wanted to, he could be completely private, but the fact that he's so willing and to open up the world of motorsport, the life of a photographer in this way, it's really cool to see him kind of row in that popularity and kind of maintain that throughout different weekends. Different things he'll do and say, whether it's Instagram or TikTok or whatever, will pop up and will go viral, and he's getting the attention he deserves, which is really, really cool. And I'm a big fan of Jamie's work, both as a photographer but also the way he carries himself on social media, how open he is with the fans, and there's a lot to be learned from him, not only behind the camera but just in the kind of general maintenance of an online persona. So watching Le Mans as someone who's coming at it from a relatively newcomer perspective was really, really satisfying and really, really cool to kind of see it from his eyes and that experience, especially after talking to him about it, right, and learning everything that goes into a Le Mans weekend, seeing that play out this year. Really, really cool, and big fan. Check out James' Instagram if you haven't already. Really would recommend it. And lastly, jumping now from 4 wheels to 2 wheels, we've also got the return of MotoGP this weekend at the MotoGP of Germany at the Sachsenring, a track where Marc Marquez typically dominates, and ever since he started racing there in the Premier class, I believe in 2013, he's won every single round there, and I think he's got a similar record at the Grand Prix of the Americas that was ended last year. But as we know now, with the shoulder injury that Marquez has sustained, he's not able to compete this weekend, and it looks like we're going to have to find a new king of the Sachsenring. That's what a lot of the media attention has been focused on, of who's going to be able to kind of take that crown and put in a performance when the absence of Marc Marquez is going to hit so hard. We know he obviously hasn't been the same ever since that crash in 2020, right? He had a pretty good recovery in 2021, got some wins there, but was never looking like the rider who could dominate from the front or be insanely aggressive and wild, handbrake turn, kind of backing it into the corner, almost Casey Stonering it on the way into those corners, and finding a way to so riskily but also rewardingly draw the speed out of the bike. I'm not sure if that's a phrase that actually exists in the English language, but why not? Let's make it up on the podcast, because it really did seem to apply to Marquez, because he could just take those risks and reap those rewards more than anyone else, and he always had that margin on the field when he was competing in his prime years. But it looks like those are over now, and the reigning world champion Fabio Quartararo has really proven to be the class of the field so far in the 2022 MotoGP World Championship. And as we spoke about with Matt last week, the surprise of the field has been Aleix Espargaro, and really how quick that Aprilia bike is. The fact that the Aprilia bike is now competitive, competing for wins even, and more often than not, delivering a bike that's going to be competitive on different kinds of tracks and going to bring a challenge to Quartararo in the kind of vacuum left by Ducati while they suffer crashes that were not their fault in Spain and a technical kind of failure to produce a fast bike for Jack Miller's side of the garage. But there's a gap in the championship on those Ducati bikes, and Pecco Bagnaia, look, unless he starts winning like he did at the second half of the 2021 season, if he can win a bunch of races in a row, then yeah, amazing. Let's get him back in the World Championship, right? But it doesn't look like at the moment that they're going to be fighting. Suzuki are in obviously a really interesting place with their driver lineup. The fact that both drivers know they're not going to be there next year. The fact that the entire grid, the team is not going to be there next year, Suzuki. The entire grid knows that. And are looking to the rider lineup to see where they could go. My prediction is Joan Mir to Honda for Pol Espargaro, but we will see how that turns out. But I think it's a smart move both ways. While you have Marquez obviously not on the bike, not able to compete, but that bike has benefited from the influence of Marquez, the fact that they've got all that money, that sponsor attention, that having a king of the bike like Marc Marquez will give you. Someone like Joan Mir needs to be on that bike, taking what is possible to achieve with that bike. It's good enough to be competing for the podium and competing in the fight for the win at most tracks we go to, and the fact that it's not at the moment is pretty unfortunate. KTM seem kind of fluctuating week by week as to where their bike is going to be, but hopefully we get a positive one this weekend, as we know that Marc Marquez won't be there. Hopefully those points can kind of filter throughout the rest of the MotoGP grid. It would be really cool if they could. Of course, we also have along with MotoGP, the return of Moto3, probably my favourite category, if I'm really honest. My favourite category has to be Moto3, just of any kind of racing. Obviously, I mean, Formula One is what it is, but if you want to talk about real craziness, real risky manoeuvres, and a space where you're going to see an exciting lap every lap, right? There's not many motorsports in the world that can claim to have an exciting lap every lap. Maybe Le Mans is a pretty interesting one because of the quantity, the scale of it, but it's a 24-hour race, and it's not like drivers are going to be risking everything at every corner like they are in Moto3. They're almost complete opposite ends of the spectrum, right? It'd be interesting to kind of think about the comparison between the two. A Moto3 race that's maybe 40-45 minutes of corner-to-corner, curb-to-curb overtaking and mental action all the way through, pack racing around a circuit on these tiny little nimble bikes. And then you've got Le Mans, a 24-hour sports car, closed-wheel car race, where there's much less risk being taken at every individual corner, but you do still see constant overtaking because of that kind of lack of blue flag element. I'm really looking forward to the return of Moto3. Standout rider from last weekend, David Munoz, the fast 16-year-old, taking everyone's attention away from really anywhere else on the Moto3 grid. Every once in a while we end up with one of these youngsters who is just an absolute wizard on the bike. If David Munoz can bring that to the Sachsenring and put in another podium performance, or even really get in the top 10, right? If you're in the top 10 more often than not in Moto3, you're doing extremely well, because that means you're staying on the bike, you're staying out of incidents, and you haven't made a lot of enemies. Because I think it was something that Casey Stoner had mentioned in one of his interviews after the end of his career. But there are different ways to ride a bike, and there are ways that will make you a lot of enemies that's going to make it really hard to kind of flow through the grid and overtake when you need to. If you overstep that boundary of kind of aggressiveness, you're never going to reap kind of the rewards of being paid back in certain scenarios. That actually also applies very heavily to NASCAR because of the teammate dynamic and the shared kind of pushing forward together effect that you have in NASCAR, where it's much, much faster for a NASCAR to be working with another car on track. Both cars are able to go faster because of the impact of the restrictor plate and the aerodynamics that are at play in NASCAR. You're much better off with help from someone else, and therefore you're much better off having at least some friends throughout the grid, right? You can't be friends with everyone because it's a zero-sum game. There's got to be winners and losers, and you want to be one of the winners, so the other guys have to be the losers, right? You can't be friends with the whole grid, but you're also going to be super, super slow if you've got no one there to help you out. And that applies similarly, I think, to Moto3, because even though we know how aggressive it can be, it still does vary who's getting the full treatment of aggression, right? And if David Munoz comes in too hot too quickly and starts knocking people over, then it might not be the best plan for him, but hopefully at the Sachsenring, it's a measured performance. I think exactly like his one at the last race was, coming through the field, staying on the bike, letting other people have their incidents and being there to pick up the pieces of anyone else's mistakes, rather than inherently having to push yourself and make your own mistakes. Being in the fight naturally without having to push too hard and then picking up the pieces of other people's fights. That's going to be a really, really exciting race from the bike, because you're able to feel like you're just flowing through the pack kind of naturally and keeping everything under control. And if that's how David Munoz likes to compete and win his races, then it could be a really fascinating entrance to the Moto3 title fight this year. And maybe if it's not this year, because he's joined kind of a third of the way through the season, he's got a bit of a points lag there, of course, of not competing in the first rounds. It's really unfair that he's not going to have the same amount of points, isn't it? Well, it's not unfair, but obviously it's realistic that when you haven't done the earlier races, you don't get those points. You shouldn't be retroactively handed points when you join later in the championship. But the implication of the fact that he didn't join at the start may mean that his championship title might come next year, unless a Moto2 team is already reaching out and being like, oh, well, we should get this guy on board. Even if he doesn't win the title, if you perform well enough, you can get the attention in other ways. So, yeah, maybe a really interesting one for David Munoz too. I'm trying to think of any other stuff I've got to talk about this week. And I think now, as we're reaching the end of the episode, I've got some housekeeping to do, right? So for those of us maybe listening on YouTube or who don't know, this podcast is made in collaboration with the Lanscaster University student radio station, right? And it's a project that I started at the end of my second year, which is about a year ago now. And that means that we're coming to the end of my third year now. And that means, I'm no longer going to be at the university. My flat, my rental in Lancaster is carrying on throughout the summer, and I've got graduation coming up at the end of July. So I'll be back in the studio then. But yeah, I mean, it may be that this is one of the last episodes I record in this studio, which is kind of crazy to think about. I'm just here on my own now, but I've got plenty of time to still reflect on where the show's gone in the last year and the progress we've made, as I spoke about, the range of guests we've had on, whether it's Josh, whether it's Jamie, whether it's Tom Gaymore. Jonathan Wheatley at the start was obviously such a huge help to the show, and maybe over summer we'll have a chance to get him back on. I do want to keep making the show. I don't want this to seem like a kind of negative, last episode kind of thing, or it's not anything like that at all. But I am going home soon. It's the end of university for me. Fingers crossed, as long as graduation goes to plan. It's time for me to go and find a job, and hopefully it'll be something in motorsport that benefits the podcast and gives me more knowledge, more access to the industry, because it's really important to me to kind of open up the secrets of the industry and show what's going on behind the scenes and kind of bring in the fans and fans like myself, bring everyone into that experience. Hopefully, if I do find a job, whether it was my first job or something I work towards, using the advice that we actually got from our podcast with Russell, I'm looking for success in the motorsport industry, and hopefully whatever path I do find through working in motorsport reflects well on the show, and it gives me more stuff to talk about, more guests to have on, and all that sort of stuff. I am still here next week, and I'm going to be kind of pre-recording, I think, 2 or 3 more interviews next week while I still have access to the studio. So that should be good. I don't want to give any impression like we're running out of episodes or anything like that. There'll maybe be 2 or 3 more interviews that I'm going to record next week, which will then obviously be spread over the next kind of month. We've also got the British Grand Prix coming up, so we'll have an episode, an interview done for that, where we'll be previewing the British Grand Prix, everything that goes into making the British Grand Prix such an incredible event. And hopefully, like many of you, I'll be there at the British Grand Prix, so hopefully it'll give us plenty to talk about with everything that's going on there. I remember going last year. It was a really interesting event because it was one of the first things in the UK that had been done with full kind of COVID participation, and everyone was testing out this different, showing your ID on the way in, getting checked out for your card and your pre-test and all of that sort of stuff. The Grand Prix was like a big test of that, so all the systems and all the infrastructure was a little bit weird, and I don't know, it wasn't perfect, right? It's never going to be an ideal situation when you've got so many people traveling to an event like that, but the parking, the buses, it was all a bit of a mixed experience, but the racing on track was incredible. Once you got into the track, it's amazing. I mean, the atmosphere they create inside is brilliant. It feels like a music festival. I think in terms of events in the British sporting calendar, the British Grand Prix is a really incredible one, and the attendance this year I think might even be record-breaking. I know they've sold out, but the idea of selling out may changed because they might have made room for more tickets than they have previously, and then also sold those. So even though it sold out last year, I think the attendance will be slightly higher this year. And yeah, I'll be there all 3 days, and hopefully we get treated to some brilliant action. We've got Formula 2 there as well. So I'll be paying attention to there, seeing my boy Felipe Drugovich, and seeing if he can bring home a win there and get me some more search traffic. But I'm not going to be parading around the paddock going, "Hi, I'm the guy from the Felipe Drugovich video." As tempting as that is, I feel it may reflect poorly on my my image overall as I try and stake myself as a important journalist. So yeah, as I said, this isn't the final episode of the podcast ever. It'll be one of the few, last ones that I record here. And it's been a really amazing experience overall. I think, I just, before we end the episode, wanted to reflect on everything we've done with the show, the point that it's grown to, the following that we've got now. It's been amazing. I love the fact that people in, Thailand, Brazil, Mexico, we talk about these different drivers and it connects to these different people in international audiences. I love the idea that the internet enables you to connect with people on that level, and our shared passion as motorsport fans throughout the world. It's just amazing to get welcomed into the community and into the small way that I have. The fact that I can reach out to people like Jamie, people like Josh, people that I'm fans of and that I know are incredibly talented motorsport creators, and then I can reach out to them, ask them to be on the show, and learn everything I want to learn about what their life is like, what their experience is like, their advice, and make brilliant content out of it. Reach an even bigger audience through those episodes. It's amazing, and I'm over the moon really with everything that's happened with the show, the way it's grown, and as a personal thing, the work that I've put into it is pretty significant. Having an episode out every week every week where I'm here, and it's possible to get an episode done in a week time span. I haven't really missed a Friday of the days that I've been able to make a show. I have every single time, doing the audio editing, learning how to record, how to be a better host, taking the feedback, getting better technically, getting better with the editing, with the graphics, running the channel, learning about different forms of content on TikTok and Instagram and YouTube and the audio platforms, balancing everything. It's a lot of work. But it pays for itself in the community participation and seeing the audience grow. It's amazing. And if you're still listening to this part of the podcast, then thank you very much. You're a part of that. And I just wanted to say before, as this is one of my last episodes here, if not the last episode in the Bale Rig studio, I should probably say it right, Bale Rig studio. Since it is the last episode here, I should know the name by now. But yeah, just a really amazing project, and I wouldn't trade it for anything, really. I mean, I'm so happy with everything we've achieved through the show, and I hope it continues to grow. There's no sign that we're slowing down or stopping. Even if we are doing a little summer break, I'll have to get my own tech and work out my home recording setup while I look for a job in racing. But yeah, hopefully the success of the show, hopefully we'll see. But I'm hoping will help get me a cool job and a job that I can talk about on the show, a job that'll give me access to even better podcast guests, and we can keep the show growing and moving. So, as I said, if you are still listening to this part of the podcast, I'll let the outro music play soon. But just from the bottom of my heart, massive thank you. Just feeling like I'm looking around the room now. I'm here on my own, but it feels like a moment. Like we've worked on this show for a long time now, and there's been so much work that's gone into it, and so much reward from the growing audience and everything I've spoken about, everything that's gone into making this show what it is now. I'm really proud of it, and I'm really thankful for anyone that is listening and keeping up with the show. Check out some motorsport this weekend, and I'll let the outro song play. I'll be back next week with more interviews, more episodes of the Jack Threlfall Show. So yeah, let the music play. And once again, thank you so much for making this an incredible year and a really amazing project working on this show. I'm so happy with how it's gone. So let the guitar go, and I'll be back next week.